Yes, students. We will be looking at diffusion and osmosis. So, last class would have looked at cell in terms of different components that make up the cell. So now we're going to actually look at what is known as diffusion and osmosis. Now, in looking at these two terms, we're going to actually look at how substances move in and out of the cells, because the cells inside living organisms, now those cells, substances actually need to go in and out of the cell. So that is the only way the human body can actually, in terms of the different parts, getting all of the needed components. Now, why we're looking at diffusion is simply because diffusion is basically the movement of particles in terms of gas. For example, as for osmosis mostly deal with the movement of liquid, anything in terms of water. So, in order to function properly, cells need to allow substances in and out. Carbon dioxide, for example, would be one of those substances that need to get out of the cell, because if the carbon dioxide should stay too long inside the cell, then of course it can become toxic. So diffusion and osmosis are two processes by which this take place.
Water vapor spreads out into the atmosphere. It's carried by the wind, but it can also spread out of its own accord by a process known as diffusion. Invisible gases behave in the same way. Water vapor spreads out into the atmosphere. It's carried by the wind, but it can also spread out of its own accord by a process known as diffusion. Invisible gases behave in the same way. The particles in a gas move randomly in all directions. This helps explain why a gas diffuses from one place to another. You can see diffusion happening on a small scale in the lab, using bromine, an orange-coloured gas. Place a jar of air on top of the bromine, and it slowly starts to spread. It's moving up the tube against gravity. Over time, the two gases mix. After half an hour, both containers have a uniform colour. It takes time because the air and the bromine molecules are colliding with themselves and each other. So what would happen if there was no air for the bromine to bump into? All the air has been removed from this apparatus, apart from the flask containing bromine, which is isolated by a tap. Open the tap, and it spreads immediately. Watch again. In a vacuum, there's no air to collide with. The bromine diffuses much faster. See how slow the diffusion is when the flask is now full of air. It takes several minutes to get just this far. This simple setup can be used to compare the rate at which different gases diffuse into air. Nitrogen dioxide gas on the left is similar in colour to bromine on the right, but bromine molecules are much heavier. The lighter nitrogen dioxide diffuses more quickly. We can also compare the diffusion rates of other gases. Ammonia and hydrogen chloride gas are colourless, but when they meet, a white cloud of ammonium chloride forms. A piece of cotton wool soaked in concentrated ammonia solution provides ammonia gas. Water vapour spreads out into
Right, so that video basically give you an idea as to what is diffusion. So in terms of diffusion, they are saying that it is the movement of molecules, or if you want to say particles, from a region where they are in higher concentration to a region where they are in lower concentration. Now, what I mean by concentration is the area or the place where it is actually in large amount in terms of its quantity. Now, looking at the screen, you will realize that we have three jars. Number one to the extreme left, that is where what appear to be some form of pen ink. So in doing this experiment, now in the middle of the jar there where you see the ink just actually drop in, now that will be the place of higher concentration, simply because that is where you will actually see most of the ink. Now as time progresses, you will realize that it is now spreading gradually right through the entire glass. That is simply because where there is no blue color in terms of the ink, that would be the place of lower concentration. So whenever molecules or particles, whenever diffusion is taking place, those particles normally move from the place where you have a lot to where you actually have a few or small amount. So once you hear the two terms, place of high concentration and place of low concentration, all they are saying is that high concentration mean the area or the place where you actually have a lot, and low concentration mean the place where you have none at all or just a small amount. Now once diffusion is taking place, then the particles or the substance normally spread across until it is equally distributed. So if you should leave this glass, if you should leave this jar with the water and with the pen ink, after a few hours, then the entire water will actually be blue entirely, and it will actually look uniform, meaning that it will actually have the same blue shaded color right through the entire glass, and that is when it is spread out evenly. So normally diffusion does not stop until every area is actually completed, evenly distributed with the color in terms of the particles moving. Alright, so in gases and liquid, these particles move around randomly. Diffusion take place when particles are not evenly distributed. So now we're gonna actually use the boxes down the bottom to actually explain the process in terms of how the substances start to get in terms of moving and then evenly laid out within the box. Now looking at the first box, you will see they said that at the moment when the blue particles are added to the red particles, they are not mixed at all. Now you will realize that down the right hand corner, the bottom right hand corner, you will realize that that's where you're actually seeing all of the blue particles. Now if I should ask you the question and tell me and ask you to tell me where in the box is the place, where in the box is the place of high concentration for the blue particles, then you will actually see that it is down the right hand corner there down the bottom. I'm seeing somebody saying that they're not hearing me properly. Is that so for everybody? Brooks. Brooks say that she is not hearing me.
Sir, I'm hearing you
Oh,
perfectly.
Okay, then I'm wondering maybe she have an internet connection problem. Right, so I'm saying that if I should ask you the question, looking at the first box, that is the one to your extreme left, if I should ask you where is the place of high concentration for the blue particles, then you should tell me that it is in the bottom right hand corner. And that is simply because in terms of all the blue particles, that is where you're actually seeing them. Now to the upper top left hand corner now, that would be a place of low concentration for the blue dots, because if you realize you're not seeing any there. Now simply because we're talking about diffusion, as time goes by, the blue dots in terms of particles, what they will be doing now, they will actually colliding with each other. That means that they will actually bouncing up with each other randomly until they are evenly distributed across the box. That is why as you move along to the second box, you will see they say as the particles move randomly, the blue ones begin to mix with the red ones. Now what we mean by randomly is that there is no uniform way in terms of how they are moving. It is like I would put the entire class in a classroom and blindfold you all and actually put you all at one, to one corner of the classroom. If I should now blow a whistle and tell every student, so guess what? After I blow the whistle, you need to find your individual space. What that means is that if whenever you're walking around while being blindfolded, once you bounce up into somebody, you actually need to move from that person and just stand up somewhere by yourself. After now, if I should do that, let's say for example for a few minutes, and once everybody find their individual space, not touching each other, because that's once I remove that thing from your eyes in terms of the blindfold, then you will realize that the class actually spread out evenly, or they spread out within the classroom. That is the same principle for diffusion. Once the particles realize that they're gonna bounce up in another particle, then it actually gonna find a free space for itself. So after a while, it's gonna now actually spread out right across the box. So as you move on, you will realize that at the third box now they are saying as the particles move and spread out, they bump into each other. This helps them to keep spreading randomly. So once they bounce into each other, they're not going to stop move until they actually find their individual space where they are not all bundled up at one corner. And at the third box now they are saying eventually the particles are completely mixed and diffusion is complete. So once you're looking at diffusion, that is how the particles normally collide. Now let's say for example I'm gonna use a scent in terms of somebody cooking in the kitchen. Now if somebody is cooking in the kitchen and the pot is giving off some form of scent, then right around the stove there will actually be the place of high concentration in terms of the scent that is coming from the pot. That is simply because that is the source, so that must be the place of high concentration. While let's say for example you're in the living room or you're in a bathroom or a bedroom, then those would be the place of low concentration. Now as time progress, now let's say for example the living room where somebody is watching the television, that's the room that is closest to the kitchen. Now if somebody is sitting there, that person gonna smell the food um, before the person who is in the bathroom or a room that is further away from the kitchen. But as time progresses, the scent now gonna spread out in the entire house by that process that is known as diffusion. So again, in the kitchen, that's where it will be smell the strongest, and that will be the place of high concentration. Now, as time progresses, gradually spread out throughout the house, and then it evenly distributed. And whenever the scent is evenly distributing, then person will realize that it is not strongest at any point, because the more it spread, less are going to be in terms of you being able to simulate, because it is trying to spread out as far as possible within the host, and that is diffusion, where substances normally move from a place where you have a whole heap to somewhere where you have small amount, and once it's spread out, then it's gonna actually spread out evenly, and once it is spread out evenly, then the process of diffusion would complete, and they normally said that what is known as equilibrium is reached. So the word equilibrium means equality. So in terms of equilibrium being reached, then diffusion actually will stop. Now diffusion and cell membrane. So after looking at the definition for diffusion in terms of what it is, then we now need to look at how substances move into and out of human body cells by this process that is known as diffusion. So on the screen we actually have example of a cell. Now you will realize that it said diffuse in, and we also have diffuse out. Then we have the red dots and we have the blue dots. The blue dots represent oxygen. So oxygen is diffusing into the cell. That's where the blue arrow is showing. And the red arrows represent carbon dioxide. And you're seeing they are showing that the carbon dioxide is diffusing out of the cell there. Now in terms of place of high concentration and low concentration, when you look at the screen, you will realize that you have more blue dots outside of the cell than what basically inside. And in terms of the red ones now, if you look at it, you will realize that you have more red dots inside the cells and versus outside. So looking at that image, I can ask you in terms of question to tell me where is a place of high concentration for the oxygen, and that would be outside of the cell, and a place of low concentration for oxygen will be inside. Why that is so is simply because you will realize that on the outside you actually have more blue dots, so that's why it is a place of high concentration as for the oxygen, and it is the opposite in terms of place of high concentration for the carbon dioxide. So as time progresses, then you will be having oxygen being diffused into the cell, and you will have that diffusion taking place until what is known as equilibrium reach. That means the same amount of oxygen inside is the same amount of oxygen outside. But as time progresses, the oxygen inside the cell will constantly using it up. And once the cell are using up, then eventually it will get less again. And you're gonna have more outside, and it just and the fact that more is outside once again, then you don't gonna have diffusion allowing to actually go inside, and the cell use it up, you go inside the cell, use it up. So at any given moment, there will always be less oxygen inside the cell, because once the cell get the oxygen, the cell are going to use it up. But because there's a process that is called diffusion always going to ensure that that amount of oxygen in the cell is maintained. So substances pass into and out of the cell through the cell membrane. So these substances in terms of the oxygen and carbon dioxide, in order for them to enter or leave the cell, it is through the cell membrane. So the cell membrane is that part of the cell that again surround the cell. So the cell membrane is like a boundary between the internal cell components and what are outside of the cell. So they are saying that the cell membrane is a barrier with tiny pores or holes in it. Small molecules, so small particles, small substances now they are talking about, such as oxygen, carbon dioxide, water, glucose, are able to diffuse through. So that is a list of the different things that either go in or go out of the cell. So when you look at this list now, you need to you should be able to differentiate and tell me the ones that will actually need to go in the cell and the ones that need to go out of the cell. So oxygen, for example, definitely would diffuse in the cell because that's where it is needed. In terms of carbon dioxide will diffuse out of the cell because it is the cell that produces carbon dioxide and it is of no use. It is a waste material inside the cell. So once the cell produces it, then it needs to diffuse out so that your respiratory system can breathe it out. As for the water now, water can diffuse in and water can diffuse out. So if you are drinking enough water, then water will diffuse into the cell. Now let's say for example you're not drinking enough water and your cell have some water in it, but your blood needs some water. Then in that case, the water will diffuse out of the cell. As for glucose of course will diffuse into the cell because glucose is where the cells get the energy from. So once you eat some carbohydrate, for example, then the carbohydrate gonna be broken down into its simplest form, which would be glucose, because glucose is a format that your body cells can utilize as carbohydrate. So once it is in that form, then your body cell will actually take it in, and it is a process of diffusion that will allow the glucose to diffuse from outside the cell into it. So they are saying that large molecules such as protein cannot go through or cannot penetrate that wall. So again, in terms of the substances, that's the third point I'm giving you, the substances that diffuse in and out. So oxygen will go in, carbon dioxide out, water will actually go in and out. It all depends on the amount of water that you're drinking, while glucose will actually go into the cell because that's where the cell will get all of the needed energy to carry out its function. So cell membrane is called a partially permeable as it allow only some substances to pass through. Right, so they normally describe the cell membrane as being partially permeable or semi-permeable. What that means is that because partially means some and semi means some. And what that basically means is that your cell membrane will only allow some substances to either go into the cell or out of the cell. So things that are poisonous, for example, things that will harm the cell or harm the inner cell components, the cell membrane will actually try to prevent those from entering. So basically, the cell membrane have a selective way of doing things. Yes, yes, Menin.
Excuse me, sir, but we actually asked in right now.
You're breaking up. I guess you're saying that you have a next class now. Yes, I realize that. That's what you're saying. Yeah, you're breaking up, Menin, but you can type what you're saying. But I guess you're saying that you have a class now, right? So next class will actually pick up the discussion. So I will post the notes in a different format. Yes, Menin, I get you. All right, no problem. All right, so next class we continue discussion. So move on to your next class because I have another one now.
Yes, sir. Bye, sir.
All right, bye.